Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's review is the suggestion of patron ASDF-JKLSC, who wants me to take a look at Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining. The film came out in 1980, making it one of the last that he ever directed. The story about the story. This will be the third Kubrick movie I've reviewed. Previously, I've covered both 2001: A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange. This is also the second Stephen King adaptation I've looked at, and I've got one of his novels lined up for a later review, so I'll skip past the creator discussion and get right to The Shining itself. The Shining was Stephen King's third published novel, following Carrie and Salem's Lot. Carrie got a film adaptation in 1976, and Salem's Lot got a miniseries in 1979, and so it wasn't too surprising that in 1979, or thereabouts, Kubrick decided to adapt The Shining. Apparently Kubrick was disappointed with the poor reception of 1975's Barry Lyndon, and so he decided to create a more commercial film next. With that in mind, he read through a stack of horror novels and eventually settled on King's book. The Shining was based on Stephen King's brief time living in Colorado. While the movie is set in the same place, the establishing shots were filmed in Montana and Oregon, while the interior shots and some of the close-in exterior shots were filmed on sets just outside of London, England, which is where Kubrick lived at that point. Jack Nicholson was Kubrick's first pick to play Jack Torrance, the father, possibly because of his performance in 1975's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Shelley Duvall would play Wendy the mother, but I imagine she wishes he had picked someone else, because Kubrick basically antagonized her into having a mental breakdown on set and on camera for the sake of realism. But from what I can tell, what actually happened is that her acting ability suffered, and so her performance was, and still is considered, one of the weakest aspects of the film. The Shining came out in May of 1980 in the United States, earning a relatively modest $46.2 million on a $19 million budget, and getting mixed to bad reviews from the critics. The film would later be reappraised and get both better reviews and a wider audience, but because of this disappointing premiere, Kubrick would go back to the editing room and cut the film down by about 25 minutes to create a more punchy version for European theaters. One person who still doesn't like the film is Stephen King himself, who made a point of giving himself more creative control when the story got adapted again for a TV miniseries in 1997. The reasons for this dislike seem to change depending on who you ask and when, but from what I gather, the main sticking point is that, in the book, Jack becomes a monster partly because of alcoholism, and in the movie, that's not really the case. And since the book is partly an allegory of King's own struggles with alcoholism, I imagine that he thought that Kubrick had missed the point. But enough about author perspectives. Now it's my turn to take a crack at it. The review. Jack Torrance is a writer from Vermont who gets hired to maintain the Overlook Hotel, a remote resort in the Rocky Mountains that closes during the winter months. He brings along his wife Wendy and his son Danny, even though a previous caretaker killed his family and then himself. And on the day they arrive, the head chef Dick Halloran takes Danny aside and tells him that he has the Shining, which basically amounts to telepathy, clairvoyance, and premonitions. Over the next 2 months, Jack loses his mind, partly because of the isolation and partly because of the spirits haunting the hotel. He eventually grabs an axe and tries to kill his wife and son, but he only succeeds in killing Halloran, who had returned to the hotel when Danny sent out a psychic SOS. Fortunately, Danny manages to trick Jack into getting lost in the hotel's hedge maze, and while he freezes to death, Wendy and Danny escape in the snowcrawler that Halloran drove in on. This movie is an unusual duality. The best way I can put it is that it's a great film, but a terrible horror movie. On the one hand, the cinematography is as great as you'd expect from a Kubrick film, and in fact, The Shining helped to pioneer the Steadicam, which means it has a lot of steady moving shots through areas that you couldn't fit a crane or dolly. On the other hand, the pacing is all over the place thanks to banal conversations in the middle of the film, random premonitions that spoil the later scares, and the fact that Jack doesn't really descend into madness so much as he tumbles off a cliff. The big scares themselves are also kind of random in terms of what purpose they serve and when they show up. I really got the sense that Kubrick did not know how to maintain the suspense of a horror story. The soundtrack is a mixed bag in exactly the same way. The music itself is great. Great outside picks, very memorable and very tense, and you can tell that the filmmakers followed Psycho's lead by using a lot of stringed instruments and almost nothing else. However, the intensity of the music tends to be all or nothing, and so quiet moments of building suspense have really loud music hammering the point home instead of just emphasizing it. The use of psychic powers in The Shining also leaves something to be desired. Danny's powers do have plot significance since he uses them to call the chef, who, by the way, plays an unfortunately stereotypical magical Negro role, and he warns his mother, but for the most part the powers are only there to justify some of the big scare moments, or to cut in some reaction shots from the kid when his father does something. Leaving The Shining of the title out of the movie would only require a few minor plot changes, and there's enough ghost story stuff coming from the hotel itself to keep things just as supernatural. As far as the acting goes, I have to agree with King. While Jack's alcoholism gets mentioned a few times, and the evil spirits of the hotel get him a couple of drinks, they only do so after Jack has done things like stare blankly at his family through a window and snap at his wife. The alcohol clearly isn't Jack's biggest problem, and even at the beginning he acts like he's barely holding himself together. I've seen Jack Nicholson play characters who know how to relax, so I would say that this tension was very much deliberate. Looking at Shelley Duvall's performance, I can see where the critics are coming from when they say that just about all she does during the second half of the movie is cry and scream. But considering the situation, I can also see how that's how someone in her position would react. The man she loves has become a danger to herself and her son, and while she does something about it, she also can't understand how this could have happened. I think Kubrick could have gotten a better performance out of Duvall without driving her into a mental breakdown, but I also think that she deserves more credit for her portrayal than what she got. As for the child actor playing Danny, I've got nothing bad to say. Considering his age, he put in a really good performance. Overall, I'd say The Shining is worth watching, and it has a lot of great moments in it, but as a horror movie experience, it's rather lacking. So, watch it whenever you want, and don't bother saving it for a Halloween marathon. The analysis. The analysis is a bit complicated this time around. One of the main themes of the book The Shining is the danger of alcoholism and the way it can turn a person into someone their family and friends can't even recognize. And there are elements of that theme still present in the movie, but the focus has largely drifted away from drinking. Instead, it seems as if Kubrick's intention was to present a horror that was more essential than an addiction, a pit of darkness that anyone could fall into, with or without alcohol to speed things along. Like I said in the review section, the Jack Torrance of the movie puts on a thin veneer of calmness when he's talking to people, but just beneath that surface is a boiling mass of anger and hatred, just waiting for an excuse to get out. Liquor is one such excuse, but then so is the isolation of the Overlook Hotel. Heck, he doesn't even make it through 2 of the 5 months he signed up for. This breakdown also happens to the other Torrances. Wendy tries to enjoy herself and act like she doesn't know that her husband is losing his sanity, but when she's confronted with the truth, she goes through a nervous breakdown. Although she is still present enough to defend herself multiple times, help her son escape when Jack starts breaking down the door, and then escape the hotel entirely in the snowcrawler. As for Danny, he essentially develops a secondary personality that he names Tony, who handles all of the extra information he gets from his psychic senses. And when Danny is overwhelmed by everything, Tony takes over and warns his mother when Jack comes for them. So with all of that in mind, the theme seems to be that we humans are one bad day, or several bad days, away from dropping our so-called civilized behaviors and reverting to a more primal, emotional state. The spirits of the Overlook Hotel may have done some pushing, but what came out of Jack, Wendy, and Danny are things that were in there to begin with. Things that we pretend aren't there so that we can get along with others, but which will never go away no matter how much we try to suppress them. These primal states, or just the idea of the id getting loose, is something you see throughout Kubrick's films. Alex and his gang let their ids run wild through A Clockwork Orange. Dr. Strangelove's humor is based on people trying to sound smart when they're doing stupid things, and even 2001: A Space Odyssey focuses on the evolution of humanity from primal apes to something more transcendent. I like to think it was Arthur C. Clarke's influence that made the movie's ending more hopeful than Kubrick's usual works. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.